Hey there, guys, and welcome to the reality show. Today I'm joined by Matthew, Michael Liebowitz, and Anders. Thank you very much for joining me, guys. Our main topic today is we're going to be talking about how Western nations should go about dealing with dictatorships in the world. For a long time now, Western nations have had diplomatic relations with a lot of these dictatorships, economic trade, and so on and so forth. And it's gotten us into a lot of kind of sticky situations where we would actually probably rather not be doing business with a lot of these places, and yet it would be at our huge disadvantage because we become kind of economically entangled with them to withdraw diplomatic relations, economic trade, and so on and so forth. And a lot of people in the West, I think, don't know how to resolve that issue. So that's something we're going to be talking about now, and hopefully we'll have the issue resolved by the end of the hour, and Western governments should all come watch this video and get it all sorted out. So Michael, I'll start with you. Something which James and I were just talking about was the BRICS nations. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then a bunch of others are just about to join them. Particularly Russia and China, countries which are very hostile to Western interests and which have made it clear that they are against basically Western interests in dealing with Israel. And relations with Russia especially, we saw a huge sort of damage to a lot of Western nations in terms of energy once Russia invaded Ukraine. At least in the UK, there was a huge ramification for energy prices in the UK. And so a lot of people were reluctant about imposing sanctions on Russia and about damaging relations with Russia. And so therefore would say, let's not do that. And but how should we go about dealing with countries like Russia, like China, and so on?
Well, the way I see it is there's two distinct things going on. There's trade in economics where the citizens of one country are doing business with citizens of another. And then there's diplomatic relations where governments deal with each other. As far as economic trade goes, I think that people should be free to trade with whomever they want, with the possible exception if we're at war with a country and we've declared that country to be an enemy, which we clearly haven't done with any nation in the world. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is a bit tricky because the idea is if you deal with the governments of other countries, you give them your moral sanction. My problem is, and it's growing for me to be a bigger and bigger issue, is the moral superiority of the West or the United States, for that matter. It's not as if we're a beacon of moral purity over here. We're driven largely by collectivism, by intervention in wars that we have no business being involved in. Our leaders lie to us and they lie to other countries. So to say, well, for instance, I mean, if you take Joe Biden, we could say, should not give Xi Jinping his moral sanction. Well, who the hell is Joe Biden to give his moral sanction to anybody? I don't, he's not a moral pillar. So I think that the bigger question and the bigger goal should be, rather than figuring out what foreign policy should be and what countries we should deal with, is to focus on the places where we live and the people that we're around to try to build a stronger moral base. Thus, when it comes time to make those decisions, we can say, okay, I don't think this country should be lending its moral sanction to a country like Russia or China.
Matthew, I'll come to you. So Rand was very critical of Western nations being involved in these ways with certain countries like China. And I was speaking before about how she was very critical of the Nixon administration for going over and having a state visit with China. What do you think about how we should deal with this? Do you find more sympathy with the kind of realpolitik Henry Kissinger types who think that there's an imperfect world and we just have to unfortunately get our hands dirty with these countries?
No, I mean, in an ideal world, by which I mean this is not going to happen, I would say the free countries or relatively free countries just basically have nothing to do with any of the authoritarian countries, save possibly if there is some kind of crisis situation that may lead to war, then in those circumstances there may be room for diplomacy in an attempt to avoid or avert actually going to war. But otherwise, ideally, I would say the free countries should just have nothing to do with them.
Mm. So, Anders, and then I'll come to you. So, but I think a lot of Western leaders basically view that the idea that we should have nothing to do with them is kind of being impossible. So, do you think it's impossible, or do you agree with Michael that we should focus on ourselves more?
Yes, I think we have to. I do agree with Michael, if I understood him correctly. I mean, we have to always keep in mind that a rational foreign policy is put in place to protect the interest of American individual citizens, the rational self-interest. I mean, there are a lot of people who are not rational in this country. So, but overall, that should be the goal. Now, with that in mind, and as I have written on repeatedly, is that I think the best foreign policy doesn't really involve other countries at all. It's about leading by example at home. So if we put our house together, and liberalize the economy and kind of reduce government in the US, and I realize that's not going to happen anytime soon, but if that happens, you would see economic growth take off instantly, and we would race ahead of everybody else in no time at all. And when such a thing happens, when we lead by example at home, then you see other countries getting interested, and the people of other countries, not necessarily their leaderships, but they get interested and they want to emulate us because they also want some of that growth, and they see how good it can be. I mean, we saw that back in the 19th century, where you had, following the American Revolution and the next 50, 60, 70 years or so, other countries who were inspired and they had their own revolutions. Most of them, unfortunately, failed. But still, we served as an example for the rest of the world by leading by example at home. Now, that being said, we obviously need a strong military to defend ourselves, because even though we may not be particularly interested in others, they may take an interest in us, all right? So right now where we are, with a foreign policy that has been a mess for the past 100 years, having engaged us in wars that we shouldn't have been in, or starting the wrong wars, as in Afghanistan and Iraq, instead of going to the core of the matter and take out Iran. I think right now with the situation in Israel, and if I was sitting there across the table from Biden, I would tell him to be aggressive. I mean, it is, I believe, I am firmly of the opinion that right now it is in the self-interest of Americans to take out Iran, to support Israel fully in not only taking out Hamas, but taking out Hezbollah, taking out Islamic State in Syria, and eliminate all the threats there. And quite frankly, I don't think it would take that much. Iran is a very weak country. It's not like China. It's not even like Russia. It would be very relatively easy, to take them out very quickly. And we know that in Iran there is a contingency of people who are pro-West, more so than possibly in other Arab and Middle Eastern countries. And there would be a chance that they would take over and really steer that country in a good direction. So,
I'm sympathetic to basically what all of you guys have said so far, but I guess there's a couple of things I want to ask, because Michael, you made a point about who the hell is Joe Biden to think that he can withhold his moral sanction to anybody? Like, what's it worth? And I completely agree with that, but I think what someone might say in response is that an essential point is that since we are lacking in moral goodness ourselves, this makes it more difficult for us to act in a good way in regards to foreign policy. I think there's a way which I should my call for back to you and not to make it perfect and good. So even if we need to get our own house in order, that still doesn't mean that we can't be kind of trust our fundamental moral righteousness, in the sense that we are still fundamentally free nations to some extent, and fundamentally have the right interests at heart. And therefore, it's wrong to undermine us in that sense in dealing with other nations on the foreign stage. Do you think there's anything true in that, or do you think there's something wrong with that?
It's so complicated because the world is so mixed up, as are the majority of people. I mean, I deal with a lot of people that I don't think are moral exemplars either. And we make that kind of argument as we're electing people. Well, you don't make the perfect enemy of the good. The problem is you end up electing Donald Trump. And people make the argument, well, he's the lesser of two evils. He has some good policies. Well, in America, for as long as I've paid attention to politics, and I'm guessing far longer than that, people that were freedom-minded, objectivist, libertarians, a lot of them have voted Republican with the idea that, well, they're the lesser of two evil. What has that gotten us? Since the New Deal, government hasn't shrunk. Our liberties haven't increased. When Republicans get in office, they expand the national debt. They might cut taxes and give some marginal reductions on regulation, but they really don't do anything else. And it's a similar thing. So you say, well, yes, well, these other countries are so horrible and we're basically good. So therefore our moral sanction, we don't want to sanction them. We want to upstand ourselves, uphold our moral superiority. And I don't know that that's the right way to look at it. I think that in the case that we're in, the best way to look at it would be, I think that Anders said this, we want to avoid getting into wars with other countries. So you have to have some diplomatic channels open. You don't want some mistake where they think that you have a nuclear weapon on the way and you can't communicate with them because you're trying to withhold the moral sanction of Joe Biden, who doesn't have it to give to begin with. So in that sense, I think you have to have some communications open with other countries. And I'm by no means saying that we should say, well, since we're bad, who cares if, Hamas are a terrorist organization? I'm just saying that fundamentally, I think that we need to start rethinking the way that we look at both domestic policy and foreign policy in the sense of making arguments and making the case for why our vision is a good one. And once you start to convince enough people, then you have something worth fighting for, first of all. And then you stand and you look at a guy like Xi Jinping, and you've got a base from which to negotiate. And that's where I'm coming from. And I know it sounds a little confused, but it sounds confused because the nature of our morality as a nation in America, in Britain, the entire West is confused. So how do you negotiate from a position of strength, or how do you decide how to think rationally when dealing with when our representatives are fundamentally irrational? If I'm dealing with another human being on a one-to-one basis, I could follow Ayn Rand's advice and never fail to pronounce moral judgment, understand exactly what I'm dealing with. But in the case of foreign policy, I'm not dealing with anybody. I've got a bunch of liars whom I can't trust that are doing the negotiating and dealing for me. And I really don't know. I guess my answer is I don't know what to recommend for them to do, whether they should be dealing with other countries or not, other than keep us out of war to the best of your ability.
Sure. Well, I think it is understandable that it's a very tricky issue given the kind of murky waters that we're in. Matthew, so in the case of the UK, one of the areas where the UK really failed in recent years with regard to foreign policy in terms of just things that happened at home was to do with the Salisbury poisonings in 2018, where Russia decided that it could poison people who are living in Britain using a deadly neurotoxin just in the middle of an average town. And the consequence of that poisoning was almost that it poisoned the water supply and almost killed a huge amount of the countryside in the surrounding area. And that was very close to happening. And our government at the time stood up in Parliament and said, basically, we have the intelligence that says that this came from Russia. We know exactly the neurotoxin that they used, and so on and so forth. And then said that we can't do anything about it. At best, what they did was I think that they brought home some diplomats. And I think probably the reason, so that was Theresa May, who was Prime Minister at that time. I think the reason why she didn't fully cut Russia off, she kind of did some rhetorical grandstanding, then didn't do too much aside from a few things with diplomatic relations, and probably should have declared war. I have to say, like, whilst that's a really hard thing to dedicate people to, poisoning people in other countries, I think surely has to be taken as a hostile warlike action. Do you think that a lot of the kind of ineffectualness of Western nations in regards to dictatorships like Russia and so on is a fear of consequences? You know, is a fear like of the, because sometimes I think moral action has a cost. Like it takes a lot to stand up and do the moral thing in a situation. I might be wrong in saying that you have to go to war there, but do you think that it's fear of that? It's a fear of kind of of having the stuff to take a moral action?
Well, I think part of the West's problem, I guess, not just here in Britain, is that I think and also not just political leaders, but in the culture as a whole, people seem to have kind of lost their self-belief in a way. People don't want to stand up for Western values anymore, don't, maybe to some extent, don't understand Western values. There's all this, you know, moral relativism in the culture, and there just isn't either the will or the understanding to stand up and fight when something like that happens. And I completely agree with you. Absolutely atrocious behaviour on Russia's part that probably did deserve a much stronger response than we actually gave.
Mm. And then Anders, to come back to you. Partly, I want to ask you just the question I asked to Michael. What do you think about the suggestion that we shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good? Well, I'll start with that, and then I'll go on to something else.
Yeah, it's. I agree. We shouldn't make perfect the enemy of the good. I share Michael's concern to some extent, and basically with the same conclusion. I'm not sure what to do because it is such a mess, foreign policy in general. And, you know, if you say that, I mean, I said just earlier that, you know, I think the right reaction or the right action in this case would be to take out Iran and support Israel much as we can. But do I trust our leadership to do that? No, not really. And even if they would go ahead with that, I'm sure they would probably mess it up along the way somewhere. So I really don't have a good answer for you either.
Okay. No, fair enough. Well, let me ask you about Iran then, because Iran has been for a long time, especially I think amongst the Dictators, perceived as the real enemy, the kind of man behind the curtain who's orchestrating a lot of kind of proxy difficulties. But when people say take out Iran, that might be the right goal in a sense, but that seems like a much more tricky thing to do than it sounds and say just take out Iran. If we were to just declare war tomorrow on Iran, I think in a sense we would have the whole kind of international community against us, because there's no, in the moment right now, instigating factor which seems to cause it. They're going to view it as basically coming from nowhere, a war of aggression, and so on. I suspect, like, if the UK did that tomorrow, the US probably wouldn't support them. Or if the US did it tomorrow, the UK, vice versa, other Western allies wouldn't support them. So maybe you're going to tell me you don't know, in which case fair enough. But how in the long term do we go about dealing with Iran as a threat?
Yeah, so just to clarify, when I said we before, I had the US in mind. So, but if the UK would declare war on Iran, hey, we should support you guys fully. But yeah, I dispute a little bit the fact that Iran is such a power. So I think, for instance, you could take out their potential nuclear capabilities. You could take out the oil fields pretty easily. They don't have that much to respond with, and some other strategic installations, you know, and that I don't think we would necessarily have to. I mean, we would, yeah, we could take out those fundamental or basic installations to send a message, and don't mess with us, you know, and don't mess with Israel, and that would go a long way. I'm not advocating that we would have a land war or invade Iran or anything like that necessarily, but I don't think, I mean, these guys, they understand the language of power, and if you display power, then yeah, they would immediately pull back. I'm pretty sure.
Michael, what do you think about that? because there's a sense in which I think that might be the right answer, that it's not very likely that we're going to go in and completely overthrow the Iranian government, but that even if we did do that, the nature of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 was to replace the Shah and to bring in a much more radical ideology into the Iranian government, which has had now a couple of generations of basically time to indoctrinate its population into a very radical point of view. So what would taking Iran out look like from that perspective? Because let's say we did kind of cow them, as Anders was saying, we just make a show of force and show them that we're not to be messed with. They're still going to be our enemy in the long term. And do you not think that that would, in a sense, perhaps be kicking the can down the road?
I don't know on what basis right now. Like I'm with you on this one, Morgan. Like, what would America say? Hey, we're just going to bomb Iran's oil fields, seemingly out of nowhere. I mean, we don't even have an active dispute with them. It's not like we're negotiating over a hostage, or they've intruded into our waters, or us and they think we intruded into theirs. So I really don't know what the basis for that would be, but I'm very wary of unintended consequences of what can happen when you do that sort of thing, especially to a country that has not attacked us. If a country attacks us, well, then you have to go to war, and there's going to be unintended consequences, but you have to deal with them. But in this case, it's just the more I learn about the way governments lie, for starters, and the more there's unintended consequences from these things, the less I'm in favor of those types of actions. And I just don't know. If we took out, I mean, look, we took out the Taliban and we took out Saddam Hussein. And what did that do? It strengthened Iran because we eliminated their enemies on both their borders. If you take out Iran, who then do you strengthen? I mean, I know Iran's dominated by Shia. I don't know. I know that they're not exactly friendly with Saudi Arabia. So does then Saudi Arabia decide to get a little bit more aggressive in the region, or do people within Saudi Arabia get more aggressive in the region? What type of problems are we creating? I just don't see that it's worth it. And I could be wrong. I'm by no means an expert on Iran. I couldn't probably pick it out on a map. But I do know a little bit about war, and especially I'm very jaded over the last 20 years of the way that wars have been conducted, who they've been conducted against, and the way that we've been lied to.
Anders, you look like you were going to say something.
Well, I was just flabbergasted that Michael didn't know where Iran is on the map.
Geography is not my subject. I might be able to do it, but I don't know.
It's in the middle somewhere.
It's in the middle somewhere. Yeah.
And well, Matthew, I'll come to you with the same question in effect, because I mean, I think especially, although there are lots of people in the West who identify Iran to be an enemy, I think it's very common for objectivists to cite Iran as being the enemy. Famously, Leonard Peikoff went on an American news show whose name I'm forgetting right now and said that we need to take out Iran. Do you have any other thoughts about in what way we can kind of deal with that, or do you kind of agree with Michael that it'd be very tricky to do?
Well, I guess the danger with actually declaring war on Iran when they've not sort of directly done anything to us is you're running the risk of other countries, potentially Russia and China, then coming into the war on Iran's side, and potentially quite a sort of horrific situation down the line. I'm also not an expert on Iran, I have to say, but it does seem, from what I understand, that certainly amongst the youth, there is some opposition to the current regime now. There have been protests for some time since, as far as I understand it, a young girl was basically murdered for being outside without a hijab. There was some sort of basically a violation of the dress code in Iran, and there have been months and months and months, and I think probably over a year and a half now, sort of protests about it. So there is some appetite there for change, even if it's just disorganized protests. Perhaps there is some way that the Western governments could somehow support or encourage those elements in Iranian society without actually sort of going to war ourselves.
Mm. Well, that's a good point, actually. I always forget when we're talking about this on the show about the protests going on in Iran. Just a few weeks ago, there was the instance of the girl who was on the train, very similar, who it seems to have been was killed whilst on the train for not wearing a hijab. So hopefully, I mean, I guess the best thing, because we're all saying we don't know. I think that's fair enough. I said at the beginning we'll solve Middle East at the start of the show, and it's probably not. But I guess hopefully, at least as far as Iran is concerned, I guess what Western nations have to encourage and hope for is a kind of Berlin Wall situation where kind of it's the people in the countries who initiate the change. But I think we've exhausted that topic a little bit. So we're going to talk about the hostage deal. So I'll just read out the details of it. I don't know if you guys saw the details, but so the deal as it stands at the moment, it's not been technically confirmed by the Israeli cabinet just yet, but it seems like basically it's going to go ahead, and the cabinet approving it is just a kind of sanctioning, rubber stamping of it. It seems like it is going ahead. The deal at the moment seems to be that 53 captives are going to be released on the first phase, and then there's going to be 20 released later. And this is going to be a swap of hostages for Palestinians who are residing in Israeli prisons, supposedly some of whom are women and children as well. So, and the first people who are going to be released in the swap are women and children, men coming later, presumably. This has resulted in some criticism in Israel, more so from the kind of right-wing religious parties, unfortunately, since the reason they've criticized it is being against Israeli security. And it's unfortunate in the sense that they are the ones who are having to make that point. You'd hope it was coming from perhaps more level heads. One, what do you think about the idea of the hostage deal? Do you think it should be going ahead? Do you think you should ever make a negotiation like this? I know when we did our first video on the war 6 weeks ago now, Nikos was more in favor of exploring the idea that you could get the hostages out, and Razi was very much of the view, which I think Yaron Brook has also voiced, that basically the Israeli government has to act like those hostages are dead, that they've already been killed. Because one, perhaps because it's likely that they have been, but also because it's going to hamper Israel in its military action going forward if they have to keep considering the hostages. So, well, let's just start then with what do you think about the proposed deal and with ever negotiating for a deal? Matthew, Michael, I'll start with you.
I think it's reprehensible. I think that they've done this in the past. Israel always gives up far more than what they get back. When you do that, it just encourages them to do that in the future. I think we all know that. My main thing, though, with this is it goes kind of right to what I was talking about before. Is, every day on this show, we come on, not us, four in particular, but people come on the show and argue for the mere moral superiority of Israel. We make the case. I've made the case in other venues as well. But Israel seems half the time more concerned with international opinion, which is never going to be in their favor. I don't care what they do. It doesn't matter. They're not going to please the UN. That's all there is to it. That's never going to happen. Or they're catering to protesters at home. It's unfortunate. It's horrible. It's horrendous. You have 240 hostages taken. But now you're going to ensure that more is done in the future. So they're operating on this short-range pragmatism that ultimately is going to bite them in the ass. So what are we supporting ultimately when you continue to support somebody that's morally mixed? And I'm not suggesting withdrawing moral support for Israel. I'm just throwing it out there as a question that, like you said, who's the ones that are complaining about the hostage being taken? The religious element, right? Well, I don't want to make common cause with the religious element. I mean, that's not my goal. I've seen people make this argument that, well, Israel should have the country because God gave that to them. Well, that's certainly not my argument. And when the issue, when it's such a morally mixed issue, it just makes it very difficult to make the case and to continue to make it, especially when Israel does stuff like this, where they're going to trade. I think I read this morning, it's going to be 4 for 1. I don't know if that's what they finally, resolved on, but you're giving up 4 people for 1. to a terrorist organization that's been doing this to you now for what, 25 years? Hamas has been or it's longer than that, right? It's 35 years. I'm sorry. It has been in existence. And so what are we doing? Like, what is the point of all the arguing for Israel if they're not even going to fight to win the war for themselves?
So Mark's just joined us. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Mark.
Hey.
We're just talking about the hostage deal, which has been sort of finally announced in the last few hours. And a detail I forgot to mention is that as part of the deal, they're going to cease fighting for 4 days as part of this as well to facilitate the swap. So Anders, I'll come to you then. Do you agree with Michael?
Yeah, 100%. And I could end right there, but one question in my head is, how much pressure is the U.S. putting on Israel here? Because I think the U.S. is really the only country that they're listening to. I don't know that Israel cares too much about what the UN is saying, but I mean, if Israel said to Biden, thanks, but no thanks, we're going ahead with this, we're consider the hostages dead, we're going to clean out Hamas from Gaza ASAP, would the U.S. then pull out of the Mediterranean, and then take our Navy leave there? Is that what they're asking? I mean, I obviously have no idea, but I'm just thinking. I suspect that we the U.S. are more guilty here than what maybe we read about in the media and what comes across to the public.
Yeah, I think there's something true about that, in that Western nations, particularly the US, I think have a large diplomatic wing which are able to leverage a lot of pressure onto the Israeli government to do these kind of things. Then Matthew, just before I come to Mark, I'll ask you. I guess what's really worrying about this is, although Israel's taking this action, which I think is fairly able to be criticized as it acting not ultimately in its long-term interest, it's going to disadvantage itself to do this. Is this a sign that they're going to actually declare a ceasefire, and a permanent ceasefire? Because the way this conflict has always happened before is that the conflict breaks out, the Israeli government makes some very tough statements, like we've seen, and said, this is it this time, and then inevitably we got negotiations, calls for ceasefires, and so on, and then it grinds to a halt. So one, the same question as I asked Michael and Anders, what do you think of the deal? But then, is this a sign that Israel might actually end up calling a ceasefire?
Well, on firstly, if I can just very briefly deal with the hostage negotiation thing. So I basically agree with what Michael and Anders have just said. Obviously, the danger with even being willing to negotiate for hostages is that you are effectively encouraging future hostage taking, because the terrorists all see that they are going to sort of get you to the table and try and get whatever concessions they want out of you. I'm actually surprised, to be honest, that Netanyahu hasn't already sort of buckled to international pressure before now. I think there was a point probably a couple of weeks ago where things, the sort of tone of things seemed to start to turn in terms of what other countries were saying about what was going on, and I could sort of just see, based on what's happened in the past, is this where Israel's going to kind of slow things down and stop being so aggressive, and it'll all just fizzle into a ceasefire and Hamas will still be intact? I guess that may well be what happens. I don't know. I hope Israel do finish Hamas off, get them out of the way when they have come this far. But I guess there is a chance that this is where they're going to fizzle out, and this will be it until the next time Hamas decide to do something.
Yeah. Well, then to come to you, Mark. What do you think of? Oh, sorry, Anders. Did you want to say something? Did you say something?
No.
I'm sorry. Okay. Mark, one, what do you think of the deal? And the same question: do you think this is a sign that the war is fizzling out? A lot of things that I've seen in the media in the last few days have been people who were initially kind of supportive of Israel, kind of starting to voice cynicism about the whole idea that Israel could take out Hamas in any case. And this was surrounding some media articles that were concerned with the guy who's supposedly leading Hamas forces on the ground. And yet, even if they take this guy out, a lot of the leadership still residing in Qatar, who is supposedly facilitated a lot of this deal in a rather reprehensible way. So what I'm wondering is this deal a sign that Israeli leadership has kind of buckled to the pressure and is worrying, well, even if we go and do all this stuff, we're incurring a lot of international criticism on us, and that we want to get the hostages out, and we're not even going to be able to take out Hamas anyway, just in Gaza. So what do you think?
Well, I feel like our pundits, once again, our political pundits have gotten us into a swamp that they didn't know how we got into it, and they don't know how to get us out of it. As usual, their blundering is responsible for pretty much every tragedy we experienced for the last 75 years. Look, Benjamin Netanyahu should take what he's said in his own anti-terrorist book seriously. You don't negotiate with terrorists. You don't negotiate with criminals. Human beings are not bargaining chips. The ideal should be to eliminate Hamas by any means necessary. Unfortunately, it's very hard for people at home to see the destruction that's happening and marry that destruction with the idea that it's impossible to eliminate Hamas in any other way. This is not just about the eradication of a criminal organization that is a quasi-state. It's about the destruction and dismantling of an ideology. And that's going to require, there's nothing pretty about it. It's going to be ugly, but it's going to be ugly because Hamas has made it that way. If Hamas surrendered tomorrow, that would end all the violence. Nobody in the popular press seems to understand that. And so it's the Hamas's continued use of violence that must inspire Israel to go forward until the job is finished in all its ugliness. And I think that means completely humiliating the ideology in the eyes of the Palestinians themselves and in the eyes of the world by showing them that you hold this ideology, you meet with utter and total destruction. And by taking out the leaders in Qatar completely, and by cutting off diplomatic relations with states like that. I think the letter that I got was about, the note that I got describing this episode was, what types of relationships should we have with authoritarian countries? And the answer is none. We should have zero relationships with them. We shouldn't have economic relationships with these folks. We shouldn't promote, because that promotes the legitimacy of their state. And their state is illegitimate in the eyes of anybody who's accepted Enlightenment principles. Their state is illegitimate. So don't deal with an illegitimate state like you don't deal with criminals. And we should unapologetically go into Qatar and kill those Hamas leaders, unapologetically, without permission. Go in there and do it. But we're afraid that widening the conflict is going to inspire more jihadis. Last I looked at, widening the conflict with Nazi Germany didn't inspire Nazis. It ended up repudiating the ideology in the eyes of the world. And I think we could do the same thing here, even though the rest of the world is, I think, enamored of radical skepticism. They're a little bit harder to convince. We don't have a choice if we want civilization to keep going.
Well, I'll put the point to you that Anders and Michael were making earlier, just to see what you think, was that there's a really kind of almost like murky waters that we get into in dealing with how should we approach these foreign dictatorships, because of essentially our own lack of moral clarity here. Michael kind of made the point, that objectivists might say Joe Biden shouldn't go give his moral sanction to Mohammed bin Salman in US, and yet Michael kind of made the point, well, who the hell is Joe Biden to give sanction to anyone in any case? Not exactly like he's a moral actor. So how do you, I mean, and Michael, you can lay out the case a bit more if you want to elaborate it, but how do we deal with negotiating proper relations with these countries when we ourselves are flawed?
Well, I mean, I think we have to come at it from the perspective that of our base principles. Our base principles are good. Our base principles are sound. Unfortunately, those principles were born in a mixed world. You know, the Enlightenment is composed of good philosophy and bad philosophy, and so we can't let you know the fact that our leaders in the past and at present divorce themselves from our principles and move forward, stop, you know, future leaders from going back to those principles and using them as a guide to dealing with other countries. Yeah, we've been flawed especially because we've separated ourselves from those principles and allied ourselves with governments who are the antithesis of the things we say we believe. So I think it's moving back to a principled way of governing and interacting with these rogue states. There's no other way to describe them. I think would give moral clarity to the rest of the world, because part of the reason we have no moral legitimacy in the eyes of the world is because we've gotten in bed with the enemies of our enemies, and even though they're enemies of, say, the communists or whoever we happened to be fighting at the time, they were despicable in their own right. And you can't claim principles are moral and good and legitimate if you're separating yourself from them and not acting on them in real life.
Michael, just to return to what you were saying before,
yeah.
You were voicing kind of exasperation with Israel, and that if Israel's repeatedly refusing to kind of do the things which are in its self-interest, what should we do? In a sense, what's your conclusion from that? What do you think we should be doing in the light of that? Because there's a way in which I think we should almost, you know, Western governments have been putting pressure on Israel to make this kind of deal, and yet actually it would be more becoming for Western nations to be putting on pressure on Israel to not be doing this kind of thing. But what was ultimately, I guess, the conclusion of your point? Maybe you want to say.
Okay, well, Mark said a whole lot that I kind of would like to respond to. First of all, the part of the problem is that it's not just our leaders that have strayed from those principles. It's the populace as a whole. I mean, if you talk to American citizens and you really, most people, and get down into individual rights and what they are, either they're going to say they come from God or they're going to look at you like you're crazy. That's most people. So that's the first part of the problem, is we need people in the country to return to those principles. And I just don't think that starting with the head of state and saying he needs to have moral clarity when he goes and deals with China is the most effective way to deal with this problem. I think it's far more effective, or could be more effective, to deal at more of a grassroots level when negotiating with people, and then you don't end up with Biden in office to begin with. And unless you're going to, and I agree, Israel should go in there and absolutely destroy Hamas. That's what they should do. What they're actually going to do, what I think they're going to do, is end this without destroying Hamas. And then you've done exactly what the concern is. You've strengthened Hamas, because now they have more to add to the list of grievances that they have against Israel. They're going to say, look what they came in here and did. They came in here, they destroyed our homes, they destroyed our hospitals, they've destroyed our way of life. We need to keep fighting them. And unless you completely eradicate them, that's the issue you're going to have. A slight, I think, an error, Mark, that you made in the analogy of Nazis is this. First of all, Nazis, there weren't a billion of them on the planet. There's a billion Muslims on this planet. And a very high percentage of them already think that jihad is justifiable, and they're ripe for the kind of arguments that people like Hamas make. Now, Imperial Japan, they were pretty steadfast in their beliefs also, but a couple atomic bombs completely that put the nail in that coffin. And if you're going to do that, then I would agree with you. You can stop that ideology from spreading. But if we're going to keep nitpicking and trimming around the edges and negotiating, then just don't bother. I mean, what is the point? Like I was saying before you came on, Mark, we've been making the argument on this show now since the beginning of the war for Israel's moral superiority. What has Israel done in the meantime? They're now negotiating with hostages. They've gone on these daily, they don't call them ceasefires. I forget what they have, some euphemism that they use for not fighting. Now they're actually going to have a ceasefire so they can trade 4 Palestinians for 1 Israeli. Who knows what's next? And meanwhile, we're going to sit here and argue for their moral superiority when the best people that are standing up for Israel are arguing that, well, we have this land because God gave it to us. And I just don't know how long rational people can continue or should continue to do that.
I couldn't agree with you more on much of what you said. I think Anders and I talked last time we were on a show together that this is an all or nothing proposition. I mean, the only way you're not going to incite the rest of the jihadis in the world, which I guess is something like 23 to 24% of the Islamic community are Islamicists, is to completely and unapologetically annihilate Hamas and to show any future jihadis or people with aspirations for committing jihad, violent acts against the West, that their end will be total destruction and humiliation in the world. That's what will suppress any further widening out of this conflict. But we don't have the heart to do it anymore. And I also agree with you that on the one hand, yes, it's the people themselves who are courting with this radical skepticism that makes them morally paralyzed in this situation. But I also think that progressivism started in the elites. It started with the politicians and with the academics, and it spread to the culture. So there is a sense in which political leadership can start movements as well, and they can start movements in the intellectual direction. I think we're seeing a little bit of that in Argentina, where potentially there's a free market movement now going in Argentina. I don't know how much it's going to be able to achieve, but sometimes these things can start from the top down. All you need is one rational person up there saying the truth in front of people for it to move things in the proper direction.
What's going on in Argentina is actually something that I really want to talk about on the show, but it'll unfortunately have to wait until we've got back onto normal topics at some point in the future. Anders, just coming to you as well, what do you think about what Mark and Michael have just said?
Yeah, obviously, I basically agree with everything. Well, one thing, though, Mark said that political leadership can come from above. I would modify that slightly and say that, intellectual leadership can come from above. I don't think, I think politicians, they swim with the current, and if they see the electorate going in a certain direction, if there is anything they're good at, it's putting the finger up and sense where the wind is blowing. So I think we need I call it a moral groundswell. Basically, we've seen it in over the U.S. history here, and then to some extent in the U.K. as well, obviously. But we've seen the big movements like the abolitionist movement, like women's rights and the civil rights, and most recently here in this country, the fight for gay marriage. And you see that when you get enough people on your side, and there always seems to be a tipping point at some point. First you don't think anything happened, almost like a ketchup bottle effect. And as such movements go, if you take gay marriage, for instance, it's quite remarkable what happened, how sentiments changed over 50 years. Now, then you can argue that the pendulum swung too far in the other direction, but that's a separate discussion. So I think you need an intellectual movement and that start things and then spreads, and like the abolitionists, are out there advocating, and you don't need that many of them. You need, a couple of thousand committed people. I think the abolitionist movement at its peak back in the 19th century had about 3,000 activists. Now the population in the US was a lot lower at the time, but 3,000 people who kind of spread these ideas and started the movement, and then eventually it flipped. It took another 100 years before, racism started to become a marginal issue, if you like. But I think that's how it has to start. I think in parallel with that movement, though, getting started, I think Mark for president would be an excellent move.
Oh, wow.
Matthew, just to bring you in then, do you have any thoughts about what's just been said?
I pretty much agree with all of what Anders just said in a nutshell.
Good. Like, it's good.
Yeah. I want to say really quickly, Anders is right. When you look at American history, probably a little less or slightly over 50% of the population were on the patriot side, were rebels, and a vastly smaller percentage, of course, were the intellectuals driving the movement, and a large percentage of folks were on the side of the British. But it was the smaller percentage of intellectually consistent folks who ended up winning the day. And the Soviet Revolution, likewise, was something like 5 to 10% of the population were Bolsheviks, but they were the most intellectually consistent. They were powerful, they were loud, and they ended up changing a culture. And I think our intellectuals can do the same, or at least people putting out intellectual products like us could be doing much to change the culture too, if we have a bigger mouthpiece, a bigger megaphone.
Michael,
Mark, is the Capitalist Party putting a candidate forward?
I keep trolling politicians who are dissatisfied with the Republican and Democratic Party to see if they want to do the grassroots stuff that you need to put a political party on the ballot here, which is do a lot of signatures, get a lot of signatures on, and then get financial backing. Everybody seems to be sticking with the status quo, but that's going to change at some point. When it changes, it's gonna like you said, Anders, with the abolition movement. There's a time at which there's a tipping point, or you said this with gay marriage, where it tips and then it becomes a cultural manifestation rather quickly. I think that'll be the same with the Capitalist Party.
Good.
Morgan, can I get in for a second?
Of course you can.
I just want to piggyback on what Mark said. Has anybody here seen the movie Mobsters with Christian Slater and Costas Mandylor? Mark, you've had to have seen it, right?
I didn't see that movie, unfortunately,
Okay.
but I know what it is.
Yeah, it's fictionalized history. I mean, some of this stuff's true, but there's a great line from Arnold Rothstein in the movie that reminds me of, because the period in which you were talking, when you talked about the abolitionists and the founding of the country, and you had a combination there of smart people that were very brave. And Arnold Rothstein, when he's lecturing Charlie Luciano on how to take over the mob, he tells him, if you have balls and brains, you don't need armies. And I think that those are two things that we are seriously lacking in this country, is intelligent people that have the guts to put forward the intellectual arguments to actually change things. And as for that capitalism party that you were just talking about, Mark, I haven't really looked a lot into it, but I do think there might be a chance coming to greatly expand that sort of thing, because I'm sensing a big rift in the Libertarian Party between the traditional classical liberals and the Mises Caucus ANCAPs. And I think there's far more common ground between the traditional classical liberals and objectivists, for instance, than once you throw the ANCAPs into the mix. So maybe it might be something to look into.
Well, and now you find that about 80% of the people don't identify as either Democrat or Republican. They consider themselves independent, and I think our platform would appeal to them largely. So certainly something to look into. But I since my predominant work is as an actor, and I'm busy doing that, I don't have the time to focus all my attention on building up a party. It has to be somebody at the local level who's willing to do the footwork to establish it as a presence on the ballot, and then from there we can get people to debate publicly these ideas. And I think once the ideas are public, once somebody who's very good at articulating them gets a chance to articulate them against somebody who's doing quite the opposite, I think the choices will be pretty clear for folks.
So when you become American president, Mark, will we be in your first cabinet?
Indeed. If politics were my thing, I don't I think anybody who seeks political office has mental issues to begin with. So I would never, ever seek anything like that. Like Washington, I think Washington had the proper perspective that, at least in appearance, to not want it. I think everybody imitates that today, but for him, I think he really understood that as a true Republican, political office isn't something you make an end of. It's just a means. What's up, buddy?
Say
Well,
egoism.
Egoism.
Yeah.
Well, there is always, if nominated, you can decline, but elected, you will serve, you know, so it's
I love that.
sidestep the whole process.
Worth
I love that.
remembering, Ronald Reagan was an actor.
He was.
Yes, he was.
Although with Mark's
With some
speech he just
success,
gave,
but that bar is not terribly high.
I don't know if it's a good slogan for a new political party. Hey, be one of our politicians, where we think the politicians have to be twisted in the head even to run.
Right? Yeah.
Did we get off topic, Morgan?
We did a little, but I mean, so we can
Sorry, I think that might have been my fault. I apologize.
So do you guys? Well, do you guys have any final comments then, either about Mark's ruling or about the hostage deal or anything like that? If not, we can.
I would just like to say, Vinny, move. Mark, get in contact with me. I might have some avenues to pursue as far as that party goes, especially
Okay.
at a local level here in Connecticut.
Oh, great. Yes, thank you.
Cool. And anything else, guys, or should we wrap it up?
I'm good.
Cool. All right.
I don't have anything useful to add, I don't think.
Okay. No worries. No doubt tomorrow more details of the hostage deal will be released, as it's going to be approved by the cabinet literally as we're speaking. So we might talk about it a little bit more tomorrow. But thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow on the reality show. Thanks, guys.
Peace.
Take care, guys.
Thank you.